On the morning of July 5th, 2026, a 5-ship convoy eased along the Omani coastline of the Strait of Hormuz, hugging the shoreline like a man walking close to a wall he doesn't trust. Leading it was a Liberian-flagged crude tanker called the Hafid, fully loaded, riding low in the water. Behind her came 2 liquefied gas carriers, then a container ship, then a 4th tanker, all moving in a tight, deliberate line through water that, 24 hours earlier, had turned back 8 vessels that tried the same route. This is what open looks like now. Not open the way it was open in January, when more than 100 ships a day threaded this same channel without a second thought. Radios quiet, insurance cheap, nobody watching. Open the way a door is open when there's a man standing in the frame deciding, ship by ship, hour by hour, who gets to walk through. Iran calls the Strait of Hormuz sovereign water and says, plainly now, that it intends to charge tolls for the privilege of crossing it with special treatment, Tehran's officials have said, reserved for friendly nations. The United States rejects the idea outright. Britain and France have been warned directly. NATO has put the strait on its summit agenda, discussing a waterway barely wider than the Hudson River, as long as though it were a contested border. Oman, whose coastline forms the other wall of this channel, has quietly started collecting voluntary service fees from ships that want an escort through, the only compromise anyone has actually managed to build. War risk insurance, which cost ship owners a rounding error before all this started, spiked more than 100-fold at the peak of the crisis. It is still elevated. Brent crude, which spiked to $114 a barrel in the worst week of the war, has settled back into the low 70s. Not because the danger passed, but because the world adjusted its nerves to a new normal, the way people learn to sleep through a car alarm. Roughly 20% of the planet's oil and gas has, for years, traveled this route on its way to refineries and power plants and gas stoves on every continent. As of the week I'm writing this, about 35 ships a day are making the crossing, against a pre-war average near 110. 2,000 vessels and 20,000 sailors were, at one point this spring, simply stuck, anchored, stranded, going nowhere, waiting for someone with more power than them to decide whether the water ahead was safe. It has been 129 days since the United States and Israel launched a war against Iran that Washington called Operation Epic Fury. And that war has not, in any conventional sense, ended. There's a ceasefire. It has been broken and unbroken and threatened again more times than most people who aren't tracking a live dashboard could name. Iran's supreme leader, Ayatollah Ali Khamenei, was killed in the opening minutes of the fighting back in February. The kind of fact that would have led every newspaper on earth in an ordinary year, and now sits buried in paragraph 6 of the news. One casualty among thousands, one rupture among dozens. Here is the question sitting underneath all of it, the one this whole story is really about. How did the fate of the global economy end up resting on a stretch of water 21 miles wide? And why does the world keep betting, generation after generation, that whoever controls that water will never actually close the door? To understand why a shipping lane between Iran and Oman can hold Wall Street, Tokyo, and Rotterdam hostage in 2026, you have to go back much further than oil. You have to go back before Persia was Persia, before Rome existed, to a time when this same channel of water was already the most valuable piece of geography on Earth, for reasons that had nothing to do with petroleum, and everything to do with the fact that some doorways, once you find them, you can never really stop needing. Look at a map, and the Strait of Hormuz seems almost like an afterthought. A narrow gap between the tip of Iran and the tip of Oman's Musandam Peninsula. connecting the Persian Gulf to the Gulf of Oman, and from there to the open Arabian Sea and the rest of the world's oceans. At its narrowest point, it's about 34 kilometers across, 21 miles, roughly the distance from downtown Los Angeles to Long Beach. You could, on a very good day, almost see one side from the other. But geography doesn't care about appearances. The Persian Gulf is a cul-de-sac. It is the only way in or out for everything that Iraq, Iran, Kuwait, Bahrain, Qatar, Saudi Arabia's eastern oil fields, and the UAE ship to the rest of the world by sea. There is no back door, no alternate channel, no second bridge. Every barrel of crude loaded at Ras Tanura or Karg Island, every tanker of liquefied gas filled at Qatar's Ras Laffan terminal, every container ship calling at Dubai's Jebel Ali port has to pass through this 121-mile gap to reach anyone at all. 2 shipping lanes, each about 3 kilometers wide, one for traffic going in, one for traffic coming out, separated by a 2-mile buffer zone. That's the entire infrastructure the modern world's energy supply runs on at its most vulnerable point. This is what geographers and strategists call a choke point, and it's a concept older than any of the countries that border it now. A choke point is a place where geography does what armies and navies otherwise can't. It forces everyone, rich or poor, powerful or weak, to funnel through the same narrow space. Whoever sits astride that space doesn't need a bigger economy or a larger population to matter. They just need to be there, and to be willing, if it comes to it, to make the passage expensive or dangerous or simply impossible. Iran has understood this for roughly 2,500 years. It figured it out long before there was oil worth fighting over, back when the cargo moving through these waters was frankincense and pearls and Chinese silk, and long before Iran was even called Iran. Around 325 BC, a Cretan-born admiral named Nearchus was sailing a fleet of exhausted ships along an unfamiliar and brutal coastline, following orders from a man who had just marched an army through the deserts of what is now southern Pakistan, and was, by most accounts, losing men and patience in equal measure. The man was Alexander the Great, and Nearchus's job was to sail the fleet from the mouth of the Indus River back toward Mesopotamia while Alexander's land army struggled through the desert in parallel, so the two forces could resupply each other and eventually reunite. Nearchus's journal, preserved for us mostly through the later Greek historian Arrian, describes hugging a coastline of fishing villages, date palms, and an almost complete absence of fresh water, moving past the mouth of a gulf that opened up to their north. He was, without fully realizing what he was looking at, sailing directly past the Strait of Hormuz. He didn't linger. There wasn't yet a reason to. The reason arrived within a few centuries, carried not by conquerors, but by traders. The strait and the gulf behind it sat at the western end of a maritime network that stretched, in relay fashion, all the way to China and East Africa. A sea road that would later be called, alongside its overland cousin, part of the Silk Road. Except this branch moved by monsoon wind instead of camel caravan. Frankincense and myrrh from southern Arabia. Pearls harvested from the shallow banks of the Gulf. Chinese porcelain and silk, East African ivory and slaves, Indian spices and cotton, all of it had to pass this doorway to reach Mesopotamia. And from there, the Mediterranean world. The Achaemenid Persian kings, and the Sassanid dynasty that ruled Persia for 4 centuries after them, understood the value of that funnel well enough to fortify it, tax it, and fight over it, long before Rome had finished arguing about its own republic. This is worth sitting with for a second, because it's the thread that runs through everything that follows. The Strait of Hormuz has never, in 25 centuries of recorded history, been valuable because of what's underneath it. It has always been valuable because of what has to cross over it. Oil is just the latest cargo. The doorway was ancient before petroleum ever mattered to anyone. That doorway got its name from an island, and the island's story is stranger and bloodier and more instructive than almost anyone remembers. Somewhere around the 10th century, a small trading settlement called Hormuz, the name likely a nod to Ahura Mazda, the supreme god of Zoroastrian Persia, sat on the Persian mainland near the mouth of the Gulf, doing modest business as a stopover port. For a few hundred years, it survived the way small ports survive, by taking whatever trade passed close enough to grab. Then, sometime in the late 13th or early 14th century, the mainland town became too dangerous to live in. Raiders, some accounts say Mongol-affiliated horsemen sweeping down from Central Asia, others point to regional Turkic warlords, made repeated attacks on the coastal settlements of southern Persia, and the rulers of Hormuz made a decision that changed the entire character of the place. They moved, not down the coast, not inland to safety, but out onto a barren, waterless island a few miles offshore. An island so dry, it had to import its own drinking water by boat, named Jarun, which the relocated city renamed New Hormuz. It sounds like a strange choice until you understand the logic. An island with no water and no farmland is useless to a raiding army. There's nothing to plunder, nothing to live off. But an island sitting directly astride the only entrance to the Persian Gulf is priceless to anyone who controls shipping. New Hormuz couldn't feed itself, but it didn't need to. It could tax everyone who needed to pass and use that money to buy anything it lacked. Within a century, this waterless rock became one of the richest trading cities on Earth. Marco Polo passed through the region in the late 13th century on both his outbound and return journeys, and described Hormuz as a major hub for merchants bringing goods from India, spices, precious stones, pearls, textiles, for onward shipment into Persia. By the 15th century, the Persian poet and traveler accounts describe a city so wealthy that a local saying held that if the world were a ring, Hormuz would be its jewel. Camel caravans loaded with silk from China, pepper from the Malabar coast, and horses bred for Indian cavalries all funneled through this rock in the Gulf's mouth. And the ruling family of Hormuz, tribute collectors rather than producers, grew fat on the tolls. It's a pattern worth pausing on, because it repeats itself almost exactly 600 years later in the language of special treatment and transit fees coming out of Tehran in 2026. The Kingdom of Hormuz never manufactured anything anyone particularly needed. It never grew a surplus of food. What it had was position, and position, at a choke point, is a kind of wealth that doesn't need an economy behind it. It only needs everyone else's economy to depend on the water you happen to be sitting next to. That kind of wealth, though, attracts a particular kind of attention. And in 1507, the attention arrived in the form of 6 Portuguese warships, an admiral with a temper and a vision, and the opening act of Europe's 4th-century project of controlling the sea. Alfonso de Albuquerque was not a subtle man. By the time he arrived off the coast of Hormuz in September 1507 with a small squadron of Portuguese ships, he had already spent years establishing footholds along the East African coast and the Arabian Sea. Part of Portugal's aggressive push to seize control of the maritime spice trade that Venice and the Arab world had monopolized for centuries. His strategy, and it was a genuinely new one in naval history, was to identify a handful of choke points, Hormuz, Goa, Malacca, and control them by force, rather than trying to compete on price or build relationships with existing trade networks. Hormuz, still fabulously wealthy and now ruled by a young king under the influence of a powerful vizier, put up token resistance and quickly capitulated once Albuquerque's ships demonstrated their willingness to bombard the city. The terms were blunt. The kingdom would pay tribute to the Portuguese crown, and Albuquerque would build a fortress on the island to enforce it. That fortress, Qalat Hormuz, its thick coral stone walls still standing today on what is now Iran's Hormuz Island, became the physical symbol of a new kind of power: European naval dominance over an ancient Asian trade route, backed not by controlling the land, but by controlling the water everyone had to cross. For more than a century, Portugal held Hormuz as the linchpin of its Indian Ocean trading empire. Portuguese ships collected customs duties from Arab, Indian, and Persian merchants passing through the strait, funneling wealth back to Lisbon and turning a small European kingdom, briefly, into one of the richest states on earth. It was globalization's first violent draft. A European power discovering that you didn't need to grow spices or weave silk to get rich off them. You just needed to own the doorway everyone selling those things had to walk through. But empires built on a single fortress on a waterless rock are fragile in a specific way. They depend entirely on nobody bigger showing up. Eventually, somebody bigger showed up. And it wasn't who Portugal expected. By the early 17th century, Persia was no longer the fragmented, vulnerable kingdom that had shrugged as Portugal seized its most valuable island. It was ruled by Shah Abbas I, one of the most formidable monarchs in Persian history, who had spent decades rebuilding the Safavid state's military and, crucially, its ambitions along its own coastline. Abbas resented paying tribute to Europeans for control of a piece of Persian geography, and he found an unlikely partner in his effort to take it back. The English East India Company, which had its own reasons to dislike the Portuguese monopoly on Gulf trade, and was eager to muscle its way into the region. In 1622, a combined Anglo-Persian force, Persian land troops besieging the island, English naval ships blockading and bombarding the Portuguese fortress from the sea, forced Hormuz to surrender. It was a strikingly modern alliance for its time. A Muslim empire and a Protestant trading company, joined by nothing more than shared commercial interest, defeating a Catholic colonial power over control of a choke point. Shah Abbas didn't rebuild Hormuz itself. Instead, he shifted the region's trading center to a new mainland port he named Bandar Abbas, Port of Abbas, which still functions as one of Iran's key naval and commercial harbors on the strait today. The English, for their part, got what they actually wanted. Not the island, but privileged trading access and a share of the customs revenue, negotiated directly with Persia rather than extracted at gunpoint from a fortress. It was an early lesson in a distinction that would matter for the next 400 years. The difference between occupying a choke point and simply securing guaranteed passage through it. Empires that tried the first approach kept discovering it was expensive to hold and easy to lose. Empires that mastered the second approach, negotiated access, backed by naval power held offshore rather than a garrison on shore, tended to last much longer. Britain, in particular, was about to become very, very good at that second approach. For roughly 200 years after Hormuz's fall to the Anglo-Persian alliance, the Gulf slid into a pattern of regional trade, occasional piracy, and shifting local rule, without any single outside power dominating it the way Portugal once had. That changed again in the 19th century, as Britain, by now the dominant naval power on Earth, with India as the crown jewel of its empire, decided the sea route connecting London to Bombay and Calcutta needed policing. Britain's approach to the Gulf in this period was less about conquest and more about a network of treaties, protection agreements, and naval patrols designed to keep the shipping lane safe and, not incidentally, keep any rival European power out. The General Treaty of 1820, signed with the sheikdoms of the lower Gulf Coast in the aftermath of a British naval campaign against piracy, created what would become known as the Trucial States, the coastal emirates, including what is now the UAE, bound by treaty relationships to Britain in exchange for naval protection. Britain suppressed piracy, later worked, imperfectly and often self-servingly, against the regional slave trade, and effectively turned the Persian Gulf into a British lake, guarded by the Royal Navy, but administered day to day through local rulers who kept their thrones as long as they kept their treaty obligations. It was, in its way, the most efficient version yet of controlling a choke point. Britain never needed to build a fortress on Hormuz Island the way Portugal had. It just needed enough of a naval presence and enough local relationships to guarantee that British, and by extension, world, shipping could move through safely. The strait itself at this point was still mostly a route for pearls, dates, and regional trade. Nobody yet knew that underneath the sand on both sides of it sat the resource that would turn this stretch of water from a valuable trade route into, arguably, the single most strategically important 21 miles on the planet. That discovery was less than a century away, and it would change everything about who wanted to control this water and why. In May 1908, a prospecting team funded by a British businessman named William Knox D'Arcy struck oil at a site called Masjid Soleiman in the hills of southwestern Persia after years of costly, nearly bankrupting exploration that had almost been abandoned more than once. It was the first major commercial oil discovery anywhere in the Middle East, and it triggered one of the fastest transformations of a region's strategic importance in modern history. Within a year, the Anglo-Persian Oil Company was formed to develop the find, the company that would eventually become British Petroleum. The British government, recognizing the value of secure oil supplies as the Royal Navy converted its fleet from coal to oil power in the years before World War I, took a direct financial stake in the company in 1914, effectively nationalizing British interest in Persian oil before Persia itself had much say in the matter. A refinery went up at Abadan, on the Persian side of the Gulf near the Iraqi border, and it grew into one of the largest oil refineries in the world. Suddenly, the calculus around the Strait of Hormuz changed entirely. It was no longer simply the route for spices and pearls and regional trade. It was becoming the only exit for a resource that industrial economies were beginning to run on. Every Western power with an economy and a navy had a growing interest in making sure that oil could move, uninterrupted, from Persian and later Arab wells through this one channel, to the refineries and ports of Europe and beyond. And Persia itself, soon to be renamed Iran, and increasingly resentful of watching a foreign company extract enormous wealth from its own ground while paying the country a fraction of the profit, was about to produce a leader who tried to do something almost nobody in the oil-producing world had dared: take it back. Mohammad Mossadegh was a European-educated aristocrat, a lawyer, and by the early 1950s, an enormously popular Iranian prime minister who had built his political career on a single galvanizing demand: nationalize Iran's oil industry and end what he and much of the Iranian public saw as a humiliating colonial arrangement in which the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company, the renamed successor to Anglo-Persian, extracted the country's most valuable resource, while Iran itself received a small royalty and limited say in how the industry was run. In 1951, with overwhelming parliamentary support, Mossadegh's government nationalized the Anglo-Iranian oil company's holdings, seizing the Abadan refinery and Iran's oil fields for the Iranian state. It was, for a brief and electric moment, one of the most significant acts of anti-colonial economic assertion of the 20th century. And it made Mossadegh a hero across much of the developing world. Britain responded with fury. It organized a global boycott of Iranian oil, pulled its technicians out of Abadan, and took Iran to the International Court of Justice, where Britain ultimately lost on jurisdictional grounds. Iranian oil exports collapsed, and the country's economy, deprived of its main source of revenue, began to buckle. What followed has been documented in later years through declassified CIA and British intelligence records. In August 1953, a covert operation orchestrated primarily by the CIA and British intelligence, known on the American side as Operation Ajax, helped organize protests, bribe military officers, and coordinate with royalist factions to remove Mossadegh from power and restore the authority of the young Shah, Mohammad Reza Pahlavi, who had briefly fled the country during the crisis. Mossadegh was arrested, tried, and spent the rest of his life largely under house arrest. The Shah, restored to full power with Western backing, presided over a new oil arrangement that gave a consortium of international companies, including American firms for the first time, a substantial share of Iranian oil production for decades to come. It is difficult to overstate how much this single episode shaped the following 70 years of Iranian politics, and by extension, everything that happens today in the water off its coast. The 1953 coup became, and remains, a foundational grievance in Iran's political memory, proof to generations of Iranians across the political spectrum that Western powers would go to almost any length to control the flow of oil out of their country, up to and including removing an elected government. When the Iranian revolutionaries of 1979 spoke about ending foreign domination, they weren't reaching for an abstraction. They were reaching for 1953. By the late 1970s, the Shah's Iran was, on paper, a close American ally, a major oil exporter, and a modernizing, westward-facing monarchy. It was also, beneath that surface, a police state run through a feared secret police force, deeply unequal and increasingly resented by a population that included secular nationalists still furious about 1953, leftist students, and a religious establishment led by an exiled cleric named Ayatollah Ruhollah Khomeini, who had spent years building an alternative vision of Iranian governance from exile in Iraq and then France. The revolution that toppled the Shah in early 1979 was fast, and it caught much of the world, including American intelligence agencies, badly off guard. The Shah fled the country in January. Khomeini returned to Tehran to crowds in the millions weeks later. And by the end of the year, Iran had transformed from one of Washington's most important regional allies into the Islamic Republic of Iran, a self-declared enemy of both the United States and, before long, its Arab Gulf neighbors. The seizure of the U.S. Embassy in Tehran and the 444-day hostage crisis that followed cemented, for an entire generation of Americans, an image of Iran as a hostile, unpredictable actor, an image that has shaped U.S. policy toward the country and toward the waters off its coast for every year since. Almost immediately, Iran found itself at war, not with the country it had just alienated, but with its western neighbor. And that war would turn the Strait of Hormuz, for the first time in its long history, into an active battlefield. In September 1980, Iraq's Saddam Hussein, sensing an opportunity in Iran's post-revolutionary chaos and eager to seize disputed border territory and oil-rich land, launched a full-scale invasion of Iran. What followed was one of the longest and bloodiest conventional wars of the 20th century. 8 years of trench warfare, chemical weapons attacks, and staggering casualties on both sides, often compared to World War I for its grinding, static brutality. By the mid-1980s, with the land war stalemated, both Iraq and Iran turned to a new and much more globally consequential front, attacking each other's oil exports at sea. Iraq, unable to easily reach Iranian tankers directly from its own limited coastline, used French-supplied Exocet missiles fired from aircraft to strike ships loading Iranian crude, including at Iran's main export terminal on Karg Island. Iran retaliated by attacking tankers carrying Iraqi allied oil, specifically ships serving Kuwait and Saudi Arabia, who were bankrolling Iraq's war effort using speedboats, mines, and missiles fired from the Iranian coastline near the strait itself. Between 1984 and 1988, in what became known as the Tanker War, more than 400 commercial vessels were attacked in the Gulf, and hundreds of sailors from dozens of different nations were killed simply for being on ships that happened to be carrying the wrong country's oil. The crisis escalated into direct American involvement in 1987, when Kuwait, alarmed by Iranian attacks on its tankers, asked the United States to reflag its ships under the American flag, legally transforming them into American vessels that any attack on would constitute an attack on the United States itself. The Reagan administration agreed, launching Operation Earnest Will, the largest naval convoy operation since World War II, escorting reflagged tankers through the strait under U.S. Navy protection. The human cost of this proxy escalation was severe and, at times, tragically confused. In May 1987, an Iraqi jet mistakenly fired 2 Exocet missiles into the USS Stark, an American frigate patrolling the Gulf, killing 37 sailors. A strike Iraq apologized for and the U.S. remarkably chose not to retaliate against, since Iraq was tacitly the party Washington favored in the wider war. In April 1988, the USS Samuel B. Roberts struck an Iranian mine in the Gulf, injuring 10 sailors and nearly sinking the ship. The United States retaliated days later with Operation Praying Mantis, a one-day naval battle that remains the largest U.S. surface engagement since World War II, destroying Iranian oil platforms, sinking or crippling several Iranian naval vessels, and killing dozens of Iranian sailors. And then, on July 3, 1988, came the war's single most catastrophic and controversial episode. The USS Vincennes, a guided missile cruiser operating in the strait amid an active skirmish with Iranian gunboats, misidentified a civilian aircraft, Iran Air Flight 655, a scheduled passenger flight from Bandar Abbas to Dubai, climbing on a normal commercial flight path as an attacking Iranian F-14 fighter jet. The Vincennes fired 2 missiles, destroying the airliner and killing all 290 people aboard, including 66 children. The United States eventually expressed regret and years later paid compensation to victims' families through the International Court of Justice, without ever formally admitting legal fault. In Iran, the shoot-down remains, to this day, a raw and frequently invoked national wound, cited by Iranian officials explicitly and often as proof that the United States cannot be trusted near this water, and as justification for Iran's own military posture in the strait ever since. The Tanker War ended, along with the broader Iran-Iraq War, in an exhausted ceasefire in August 1988, with the front lines essentially unchanged from where they'd started 8 years and hundreds of thousands of deaths earlier. But it left behind something that outlasted the war itself: a template. It taught the United States that it could, if it chose, keep the strait open by force. And it taught Iran that a relatively weak, isolated, sanctioned regional power could impose real costs on tankers, on insurance markets, on the nerves of the entire industrialized world, using nothing more than mines, speedboats, and coastal missile batteries against opponents with vastly superior conventional militaries. Both of those lessons would echo for the next 35 years. The decade that followed the tanker war was, by the Strait's standards, relatively quiet. Though quiet, in this particular stretch of water, has always been a relative term. The 1991 Gulf War, triggered by Iraq's invasion of Kuwait, put American and Allied naval power back into the Gulf in overwhelming force. And while the Strait itself wasn't the primary battlefield, the war reinforced for another generation just how much Western military planning revolved around keeping oil moving out of this region unimpeded. Through the 1990s and 2000s, Iran remained under an expanding web of American and international sanctions. First over its support for militant groups, and increasingly, after the mid-2000s, over its nuclear program. Periodically, Iranian officials would respond to new sanctions or military pressure with a threat that became almost ritualistic in its repetition. If push came to shove, Iran would close the Strait of Hormuz, and the world's oil-dependent economies would suffer the consequences. In 2008, U.S. and Iranian naval vessels faced off in a tense standoff in the strait, after Iranian speedboats approached American warships aggressively. In 2011 and 2012, as new sanctions targeting Iran's central bank and oil exports took effect, senior Iranian officials, including the vice president, explicitly threatened to close the strait if Iran's own oil exports were blocked, prompting the U.S. Navy to publicly and repeatedly declare that it would not tolerate any disruption to the waterway. For years, this became the Strait's defining rhythm: escalation, threat, deterrence, retreat. Iran would rattle the door. The U.S. Fifth Fleet, headquartered in nearby Bahrain specifically to guard this waterway, would make clear it had both the will and the firepower to keep the door open. Global oil markets would spike briefly on the headlines, then settle back down once the immediate crisis passed. It was a pattern stable enough that traders, insurers, and governments built entire risk models around the assumption that Iran's threats to close the strait were, essentially, negotiating leverage. Real enough to move oil prices for a news cycle, but not something Iran would actually follow through on, because closing it would hurt Iran's own oil exports and unify the world against it. That assumption held for decades. It began cracking visibly in 2019, and it shattered completely 7 years later. In May and June of 2019, a series of mysterious attacks damaged oil tankers near the Strait of Hormuz and in the Gulf of Oman just outside it. Limpet mines attached below the waterline, explosions that set ships ablaze without sinking them, attacks precise enough to look deliberately calibrated rather than accidental. The United States accused Iran directly, releasing grainy video it said showed an Iranian patrol boat removing an unexploded mine from one of the damaged vessels. Iran denied responsibility. In July that same year, after British forces seized an Iranian oil tanker off Gibraltar on suspicion of violating sanctions on Syria, Iran's Revolutionary Guard retaliated by seizing a British-flagged tanker, the Stena Impero, in the strait itself, holding it and its crew for more than 2 months in a tit-for-tat hostage exchange conducted entirely through commercial shipping. Then, in January 2020, the United States killed Qasem Soleimani, the powerful commander of Iran's Quds force, in a drone strike near Baghdad's airport. one of the most significant American strikes against a foreign government official in decades. Iran responded with a direct ballistic missile attack on U.S. forces stationed at Al-Assad Air Base in Iraq, causing traumatic brain injuries to more than 100 American service members, but, notably, no strike on shipping in the strait itself. It was, in retrospect, a moment of real restraint from Tehran. Proof that even at the height of open hostility, Iran still preferred to keep the choke point as a threat held in reserve rather than a weapon actually used. That reserve held, on and off, through years of seized tankers, sanctions, and near misses. It held even in June 2025, when Israel launched a 12-day air war against Iran, striking nuclear facilities and military targets, with the United States eventually joining in strikes on facilities including Fordow, Natanz, and Isfahan, an operation the Pentagon called Operation Midnight Hammer. Even then, with its nuclear program under direct attack and its air defenses badly degraded, Iran did not move to close or seriously disrupt the strait, despite widespread expectation that it might. That restraint, displayed across 2019, 2020, and 2025, is precisely why what happened 8 months later felt, to nearly everyone watching, like the rules had finally irreversibly changed. On February 28, 2026, the United States and Israel launched a coordinated air war against Iran, a far larger, more sustained operation than the 12-day exchange of 2025, aimed explicitly at dismantling what remained of Iran's nuclear and military capacity. Iran's supreme leader, Ayatollah Ali Khamenei, who had led the Islamic Republic since 1989, was killed in the opening minutes of the campaign, an almost unthinkable outcome that, in any other context, would have reordered the entire story of the war on its own. Here, it was simply the first of many enormous ruptures still to come. This time, Iran did not hold its restraint in reserve. Within hours, the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps was transmitting warnings over marine radio to every ship in the strait. No vessel would be permitted to pass. Iran never issued a single, formal declaration closing the waterway. Its posture across the following months would remain a deliberately murky mix of denial, partial permission, and enforcement. But the practical effect arrived almost instantly. Tanker traffic, more than 100 ships a day before the strikes, collapsed by 70% within hours and kept falling. Within weeks, the IRGC was boarding and attacking merchant vessels, striking tankers with drones, missiles, and gunboat fire, and laying sea mines across sections of the strait. The toll on ordinary sailors, most of them nationals of India, the Philippines, and other countries with no stake whatsoever in the war between Iran, Israel, and the United States, was severe and, at times, fatal. Crew members were killed aboard vessels, including the tanker Skylight and another ship struck by what maritime authorities described as an explosive drone boat. Indian-flagged ships came under direct gunfire despite having received prior clearance to pass, forcing them to turn back mid-transit. A container ship operated by the French line CMA-CGM was damaged by a rocket strike off the coast of Oman. By mid-April, the UK Maritime Trade Operations Centre had logged more than a dozen distinct attacks on shipping, and the International Maritime Organization reported roughly 20,000 mariners and 2,000 ships effectively stranded across the Gulf, unable to safely move in either direction. The economic shockwaves arrived just as fast. Brent crude spiked to $114 a barrel in the war's worst week, the largest single-month jump in oil prices ever recorded. War risk insurance premiums for ships transiting the strait rose from a baseline of roughly 0.125% of a vessel's insured value to as much as 0.4%. in the days before the strikes even landed, and later spiked more than 100-fold at the peak of the crisis. A cost increase for the largest supertankers, running into hundreds of thousands of dollars per single transit. According to later analysis, the biggest financial winners of the disruption were countries positioned outside the choke point entirely. American oil exporters gained an estimated $50 billion in additional revenue as global buyers scrambled for alternative supply, and Russia picked up more than $15 billion in extra earnings from steady exports unaffected by the Gulf's chaos, even as every Persian Gulf oil producer that depended on the strait saw its exports decline. Saudi Arabia, which has spent decades building a pipeline across its own territory to the Red Sea specifically to avoid this kind of dependency, and Oman, whose geography lets some of its exports bypass the strait entirely, were the only regional producers able to partially cushion the blow. From mid-April to late May, the United States imposed its own blockade in the opposite direction, announcing it would intercept vessels entering or leaving Iranian ports and coastal waters, turning the strait, for a period, into a corridor blockaded from both ends simultaneously by two different militaries, for two entirely different reasons. In May, Iran's Revolutionary Guard Navy took the strategic reframing even further, declaring that it no longer considered the Strait of Hormuz to mean the narrow 21-mile channel at all, but a far broader operational area stretching along much of its southern coastline. An attempt to redefine, by fiat, the geography that international law had always treated as a strait subject to guaranteed rights of transit passage. A ceasefire, and then a formal memorandum of understanding between Washington and Tehran arrived in mid-June, brokered in part through Pakistani mediators, with provisions for a temporary truce, a toll-free reopening of the strait, Iranian mine clearance, and a lifting of the U.S. blockade. It did not hold cleanly. Within days, Iran closed the strait again, citing continued Israeli strikes in Lebanon as a violation of the spirit of the agreement, even as its own foreign ministry, hours later, told state media that shipping was operating normally, a contradiction that has become almost characteristic of how this crisis is actually managed. Two arms of the same government, in public, disagreeing about whether the door is open. Which brings the story back to where it started, to a 5-ship convoy hugging the Omani coast on the morning of July 5th, 2026, and to a question that international lawyers, oil traders, and Gulf governments are all wrestling with simultaneously. What does it even mean for the Strait of Hormuz to be open when the ships moving through it are doing so under negotiated, hour-by-hour permission from a military that shot at commercial vessels 5 months ago and has not fully accounted for the mines it laid? The honest answer, based on how maritime intelligence firms are describing the water right now, is that Hormuz has shifted from a closure to something more unsettling, a managed, permission-based corridor. Iran's Revolutionary Guard maintains a heavy presence of small craft, patrol boats, and surveillance across the strait's commercial lanes. Ships increasingly travel with transponders switched off or manipulated, so-called dark transits, to avoid drawing attention. Even as satellite imagery still catches loading activity that official ship tracking data misses entirely. GPS jamming has disrupted hundreds of vessels near key ports in a single day. Iran's own oil export infrastructure at Karg Island has, at various points, shown no active tanker loading for over a week at a stretch, even as tankers queue nearby, waiting for permission or safety or both. Meanwhile, Iran has built up an alternative export channel through the Gulf of Oman that bypasses the strait's narrowest, most exposed point entirely. A workaround born directly from months of learning, the hard way, just how easily its own choke point could be turned against it. Traffic, as of this week, sits at roughly a third of pre-war volumes. Insurance premiums remain elevated well above their historical baseline. And Iran's newest position, that it will definitely charge tolls for transit, with the possibility of discounted or preferential rates for countries it considers friendly, is, whether Tehran intends the echo or not, almost identical to the arrangement the Kingdom of Hormuz ran from its waterless island rock 6 centuries ago. Different flag, different century, same fundamental logic. Control of the doorway is worth more than anything you could produce yourself. So return to the question. This whole story has been circling. Why does the world keep assuming the door will stay open when every layer of this history says otherwise? Part of the answer is structural, and almost nobody likes admitting it out loud. There has never been a workable substitute for the Strait of Hormuz, and there still isn't. Saudi Arabia's Red Sea pipeline can reroute a meaningful share of its own exports, and Oman's geography spares it some exposure. But Iraq, Iran, Kuwait, Qatar, and Bahrain have essentially nowhere else to send their oil and gas. 20% of the world's oil, and roughly the same share of its liquefied natural gas, much of it Qatari LNG that heats homes and fuels power plants from Tokyo to London, has no alternate route. Pipelines take a decade and tens of billions of dollars to build. And even the most ambitious of them can only ever reroute a fraction of what the strait carries. The choke point isn't a temporary inconvenience the market is working around. It's a permanent structural fact that the modern energy system has simply learned to live inside. The same way Marco Polo's merchants learned to live inside the tolls of a waterless island kingdom, because there was, quite literally, no other way through. Part of the answer is also psychological. And this is the part that history keeps proving and the market keeps forgetting. Every previous power to threaten this water, Portugal, Britain, Iran under the Shah, Iran under the Ayatollahs, has ultimately preferred controlling the doorway to destroying it, because a closed door earns nothing. A kingdom that taxes ships makes money only as long as ships keep coming. That logic held for 600 years, through the tanker war, through 2011, through 2019, through 2025's 12-day war, right up until February 2026, when a regime facing the death of its supreme leader in the war's opening minutes decided, apparently, that it had less left to lose than anyone had calculated. And that is the uncomfortable lesson sitting underneath everything that has happened in this water since February. The assumption that a rational actor will always prefer an open, tolled choke point to a closed, worthless one only holds as long as that actor believes it has a future worth protecting. The moment a power controlling a choke point concludes it is fighting for survival rather than profit, 600 years of precedent about tolls and trade stops applying, and the doorway becomes a weapon instead of a business. There is something almost unbearably fitting about the fact that a body of water this narrow, you could, on a clear day, watch a ship on the far side through binoculars, has managed to matter this much for this long, to this many people who will never see it themselves. Sumerian and Persian merchants moving frankincense 2,500 years ago, Marco Polo's caravans, Portuguese cannons, English East India Company clerks negotiating tariffs, British naval officers keeping the Victorian peace, oil engineers striking crude at Masjid Suleiman, Mossadegh, briefly, believing a nation could take its own resource back on its own terms. A generation of American sailors caught in a proxy war they barely understood. One of them firing the missiles that killed 290 people on a routine commercial flight. Iranian officials repeating the same threat for 3 decades until one February morning in 2026, they didn't just repeat it. They meant it. None of this required a large piece of geography. It required exactly one narrow, unavoidable gap, and the enduring, unshakable fact that some kinds of dependency can't be engineered away, no matter how badly the rest of the world wishes they could. The pipelines get built, the alternate routes get planned, and still, 20% of the planet's oil and the ships carrying it funnel through 21 miles of water that one country half controls and another half borders. Because that is simply where the map put the door. As of this week, that door is open. Carefully, conditionally, 35 ships a day instead of 110. Under the watch of patrol boats and jammed GPS signals and a toll regime still being negotiated in real time. Whether it stays that way probably depends less on any treaty being drafted in Doha or Islamabad than it does on the same question this water has been answering, one way or another, for 2,500 years. Does whoever controls this doorway still believe they have more to gain by keeping it open than by proving, once and for all, that they can shut it? History says they almost always choose to keep it open. History also says, not always. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this journey into the past, be sure to like the video, share it with fellow history enthusiasts, and subscribe for more deep dives into the people, civilizations, battles, myths, and moments that shaped our world. Leave your thoughts and theories in the comments below. Your perspective might inspire a future video. Until next time, keep exploring history, because the past is never truly gone.